This is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the late, great Bob Newhart? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of Bob Newhart, then offer my analysis. George Robert Newhart was born on September 5, 1929, in Oak Park, Illinois. He went by the name Bob. He was raised in Chicago by his father, who had a plumbing and heating business, and his mother, who was a homemaker. Bob's entire education was in Catholic schools, including college. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in business management in 1952. This same year, he was drafted into the Army and served during the Korean War until 1954. He never went into combat, rather he did personnel file audits in bases along the West Coast. After being discharged, Bob started his career as an accountant. He had a few different jobs and eventually ended up working for an independent film and television producer in Chicago. When he was there, Bob developed a comedy routine involving extended telephone calls about bizarre situations. This started because he was bored at work. He would talk into the phone as if there was another person on the line. From Bob's side of the conversation, the audience could figure out what the imaginary person was saying. The conversation often grew increasingly desperate. One famous routine involved a security guard at the Empire State Building calling his supervisor after King Kong started climbing the outside of the building. The guard says, quote, "See, something's come up, sir, and it's not covered in the guard's manual. I looked in the index, yes, sir. I looked under unauthorized personnel and people without passes and apes and apes' toes. Apes and apes' toes, yes, sir," unquote. Later, the guard says, quote, "See, this isn't your standard ape, sir. He's between 18 and 19 stories high, depending on whether there is a 13th floor or not," unquote. Bob's investment into his comedy career paid off. In 1959, Warner Brothers Records signed Bob Newhart after a friend introduced him to an executive there. He started performing stand-up as he worked on an album. In 1960, Bob released a comedy album titled The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart. It was a massive hit, the first comedy album to sell more than 1 million copies. It is still the 20th best-selling comedy album in history. Bob released a second album 6 months later, which was also successful. Over the next several years, Bob released 6 more comedy albums. In 1961, Bob Newhart hosted a variety show, which despite being well-liked by critics, only lasted 1 season. He would later say, quote, "It got an Emmy, a Peabody, and a Pink Slip from NBC, all in the same year," unquote. Over the next few years, Bob continued to stay busy. He appeared on various TV shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, The Dean Martin Show, and The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Bob married a woman named Ginny Quinn in 1963. She was the daughter of a character actor named Bill Quinn. The couple would go on to have 4 children. In 1972, Bob landed a starring role on a TV show that would dramatically advance his career. It was titled The Bob Newhart Show. He played a mental health professional named Dr. Bob Hartley. Despite a lot of competition from other popular shows like MASH, The Bob Newhart Show was incredibly successful. The series lasted until 1978. In 1982, Bob returned to television in a series titled Newhart. He played a former guidebook writer named Dick Loudon, who decided to become an innkeeper in Vermont. The series enjoyed tremendous popularity and ran until 1990. The final episode had a legendary comedic twist. After dealing with a lot of stress and drama as an innkeeper, Dick Loudon is knocked unconscious by a golf ball. He then wakes up in bed, back as his character Dr. Bob Hartley from The Bob Newhart Show, and interacts with Suzanne Plachette, who played his wife on that show. He talks about how he had a bizarre dream about being an innkeeper in this crazy little town in Vermont. So the entire Newhart Show was actually Dr. Bob Hartley's dream. This episode is often considered one of the greatest series finales in history. In 1992, Bob Newhart starred in another TV show titled Bob. This was about a cartoonist and featured the actress Lisa Kudrow, who would later become famous for her work in the TV series Friends. The critics really liked the show, but it was canceled at the beginning of season 2. Bob tried again in 1995 with a TV show titled George and Leo. It was canceled during the first season. Throughout his career, Bob was featured in several movies, including the 1997 film In and Out and the 2003 holiday film Elf. From 2013 to 2018, Bob had a recurring role as Professor Proton on the series The Big Bang Theory. In 2023, Bob Newhart's wife Ginny died at the age of 82. On July 18, 2024, Bob Newhart died in Los Angeles, California, after a series of short illnesses. He was 94 years old. Now moving to my analysis. One of the most admirable qualities of Bob Newhart is how he didn't become something else to function as a comedian. He took his own personality and used it to develop and inspire his work. Bob was always himself, unceasingly genuine and authentic. He didn't have to get into character because he was the character. Bob was someone who appreciated comedy at an intense level. Before becoming famous, he studied other comedians and their jokes in an effort to figure out what made people laugh. When he started writing his own comedy routines, Bob focused on quality and precision, which included his timing. Nothing was ever forced with Bob Newhart. His timing was always perfect and without much inflection. From the perspective of an outside observer, Bob's performances seemed effortless. There is this theme that his talent was tremendous, but he was so casual in his delivery, it was easy to forget just how talented he was. Bob Newhart's comedic style involved a deadpan, dry, witty, soft-spoken, and subtle presentation. He was satirical, irreverent, and often played the straight man. Always a fan of dark humor, Bob said, quote, "I tend to find humor in the macabre. I would say 85% of me is what you see on the show, and the other 15% is a very sick man with a very deranged mind," unquote. One unusual feature of Bob's style was his trademark stammer. He would often pause or stutter during the delivery of key lines. This was carefully orchestrated and always perfectly placed. These pauses communicated to the audience how Bob was confused by the bizarre nature of whatever situation he was dealing with. Like Bob and the audience were on the same team, trying to understand the strangeness. In this sense, audience members could identify with Bob. They were frustrated by nonsense, just like him. Bob did not have to go to extremes to make people laugh. He could make anything funny. The simple, the mundane, the everyday, as well as the peculiar, the perplexing, and the bizarre. He was able to find strange and intolerable situations all around him. His philosophy was that comedians were inspired by pain. Bob searched for situations that didn't make sense and turned them into material. For example, one time he briefly worked for the Illinois State Unemployment Agency. Regarding that experience, Bob said, quote, "I was being paid $60 a week while the people I was giving money to were getting $55, and they only had to come into the office once a week," unquote. Bob understood how comedians must have something or someone to make fun of. In the show Newhart, the brothers Larry, Daryl, and Daryl represented a safe, reliable, and endless source of bizarre behavior for Bob to target with his razor-sharp wit. Bob's comedy was intelligent, sophisticated, and original. Initially, there was concern that his humor style would not work on television because there may not be enough people who would appreciate it. During the time that Bob was gaining fame, his mild-mannered approach and refusal to use profanity stood out from competing comedians who tended to adopt crude, dramatic, and sensationalistic routines for shock value. Bob didn't need to do this because he had talent. One of the most endearing features of Bob Newhart is how he appreciated the value of comedy at a deep level. It's more than just helping people to have a good time. Just like every art form, comedy transcends entertainment. It possesses a higher purpose. Bob said, quote, "Comedy is a way to bring logic to an illogical situation, of which there are many in everyday life. I've always likened what I do to the man who is convinced that he is the last sane man on earth," unquote. In this sense, comedy could be thought of as a coping mechanism, a way to process being surrounded by perplexing circumstances. It is the constant companion of someone who thinks rationally. Bob Newhart understood this better than most. As far as his views on authority figures and the government, Bob always said that he was anti-authority at heart. For him, a key part of being a comedian was questioning and standing up against the system. As I mentioned, throughout Bob's career, he had great success, but there were also a few setbacks. He was featured on television shows that were clever and well received by critics, but some of his shows failed to find a wide audience. This predicament may have been caused by a shortage of people with a personality trait from the 5-factor model called openness to experience. Bob's comedic style had a very strong appeal to individuals with a high level of openness to experience. People who are high in this trait tend to think abstractly, like new ideas, appreciate complexity, and are intellectually curious. They tend to be drawn to comedic styles involving irony, satire, wit, wordplay, as well as dry and deadpan delivery. In any particular population, there will only be so many people like this. Therefore, the appeal of someone like Bob Newhart will always be restricted. This may partially explain the limitation of Bob Newhart's appeal. However, there's another factor that affects how dark humor is appreciated, which goes beyond personality traits. Jokes based on dark humor involve incongruity. A lot of humor involves this, but dark humor is particularly dependent on this concept. The incongruity is about the transgression of a social norm, which creates a sense of surprise. People do not expect the joke to move in a dark direction or to step out of bounds. If the social norm transgression is taken too far, based on the way members of society tend to be thinking at a certain time, people may feel offended. Often this effect is enhanced if a person is in public, like they may look around to see how other people are reacting to the joke. They don't want to laugh if others are offended. This culture of being offended by everything is the enemy of dark humor, and by extension, the enemy of intellectual curiosity and reason. This anti-intellectual stance is the basis of the cancel culture, which involves an oversensitive and nonsensical search for reasons to be offended. Furthermore, studies have shown that people who are aggressive and suffer from mood disturbance do not have the cognitive and emotional processing abilities to appreciate dark humor. This only reinforces the anti-authority message of Bob Newhart and of so many other comedians. It's important for people to think for themselves. People should not worry about being rejected by a group of victim narcissists who have restricted abilities to process information. Independent and rational thought should be valued above self-centered and grandiose nonsense. Cancel culture is an inferior form of complaining that does not lead to social change. Dark humor, through its use of wit, satire, and wordplay, is a much more effective method of addressing injustice. Now moving to my final thoughts. I have covered a lot of comedians and comedic actors on my channel over the years. For example, I have videos on Rodney Dangerfield, Sam Kinison, George Carlin, John Candy, Chris Farley, Phil Hartman, Robin Williams, Joe Rogan, Russell Brand, and Jimmy Fallon. While some of these comedians have impressed me, like Phil Hartman, George Carlin, and Robin Williams, Bob Newhart will always be my favorite. Bob was clever, versatile, witty, precise, thoughtful, and both a student and a master of comedy. He never actually retired. In addition to being one of the greatest comedians ever, he had a great work ethic. Bob Newhart gave the public and aspiring comedians a gift which should never be discarded. Those are my thoughts on the case of Bob Newhart. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They consistently generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.